Hello, my name is Shannon Wilkerson. The following presentation represents my dissertation proposal defense for the University of West Georgia Spring 2021 semester. The title of the dissertation is Secondary Trauma, Interpersonal, Interpersonal Effects of Reviewing Police Shootings in the Media. The proposal defense agenda is as follows: research problem, purpose of the study, overview of the literature review, conceptual framework, research questions, and methodology and research design. Problem. Over the past 2 decades, researchers have studied the effects of systematic racism, discrimination, and microaggressions of African Americans. A research study conducted by Kriger in 2015 found that African Americans are killed by police officers 9 times more than other races. Due to these disproportionate acts of violence by the dominant society towards people of color and indigenous, the term racial trauma has been created to explain this phenomenon. Racial trauma occurs when a person of color and indigenous experiences personal or vicarious situations of danger involving racism. In addition, African Americans have a higher propensity to be affected by racial trauma due to intergenerational trauma. In short, these underlying conditions and continued lynchings cause African Americans to suffer from psychological and physiological effects. A 2019 study conducted by Lee and Robinson found that some African Americans exposed to police violence of other African Americans meet the criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. Some symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder include hypervigilance, flashbacks, nightmares, high blood pressure, diabetes, and irregular heartbeat. Purpose statement. The purpose of this mixed methods sequential explanatory study is to examine the interpersonal effects African Americans experienced after viewing law enforcement killing other African Americans in the media. This method was selected over other mixed method approaches due to the design providing a more in-depth understanding of the quantitative phase through a qualitative follow-up. Significance of study. This study is significant because it provides the reader with the evolution of law enforcement in America, starting with slave patrols and today's law enforcement. Debriefs the continuation of Barbados slave trade terrorism tactics used by law enforcement towards African Americans. Explains the interpersonal effects African Americans experience after viewing other African Americans being killed by law enforcement in the media. This research study also fills the gap in the literature by assessing how gender and children being killed by law enforcement affects viewers differently. In addition, interviewees proactive and reactive solutions to resolve this issue. Overview of literature review. Propaganda. The institutional practice of oppressing and legally killing African Americans in the United States has taken place since their extraction from Africa 400 years ago. In order to justify these heinous acts, the dominant society utilized propaganda techniques to maintain their dominance and racial terror towards the African American community. Pseudoscience such as criminology, minstrel shows, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and films such as The Birth of a Nation assisted in the subjugation and dehumanization of African Americans. These propaganda techniques morphed into new media outlets such as black exploitation cinema, gangster rap, reality television, and media dog whistle phrases such as calling African American suspects savages, thugs, Jezebels, and animals. These stereotypes and false narratives places blame on the victims of police shootings and sways public opinion of the incident. Some victim-blaming behaviors consist of discussing the victim's criminal history, education, mental health, and living in a crime-ridden area. In short, these media propaganda techniques absolve law enforcement of any responsibility, contaminates public opinion of the incident, and maintains the system of institutional racism in America. It also perpetuates the false narratives of African Americans being violent, uneducated, criminals, and a nuisance to society. According to Smith, the end results of this propaganda campaign could potentially parallel the genocide events of Leopold II and Adolf Hitler. The literature review later discusses the self-regulation of African Americans being oppressed through the following transitional phases: slave patrols, institutional racism, and current law enforcement. Slave patrols. The enforcement and legal justification of African Americans began with the establishment of slave patrols. The recruitment process started with the local government mandating white citizens to patrol designated areas. According to a study conducted by Williams in 2015, slave patrols were a byproduct of white racism in America. Whites who opposed participating in this practice were forced to pay additional taxes. According to a study conducted by Drew in 2015, the purpose of slave patrols was to control the slave population by regulating their movements, enforcing slave codes, and catching runaway slaves. While patrolling slave quarters or designated areas, patrols were allowed to act with impunity. This impunity consisted of castrating, whipping, maiming, or lynching slaves. A study conducted by Cheney and Robertson in 2015 reports these terroristic practices by slave patrols and white citizens effectively maintained the slave compliance. According to a study conducted by Ward in 2012, 2 to 3 slaves were lynched or burned a week. Slave patrols in America utilized Barbados slave plantation practices to strike fear into those who challenged white supremacy. Institutional racism. As said before, law enforcement evolved from slave patrols. Slave patrols were created to maintain order on slave plantations and to punish slaves who opposed them. Following the passing of the 13th Amendment, slave patrols were disbanded, but laws and law enforcement made the racist practice more covert. Laws such as the Black Codes and Jim Crow protected law enforcement from being prosecuted for lynching African Americans. Lynching in America is interwoven in white society, cultural fabric, and symbolizes acts of terrorism to African Americans. Today's law enforcement has abandoned the use of the noose and have adopted other alternative forms of lethal force, such as shooting, suffocating, or inflicting blunt trauma towards people of color. From 1980 to 2012, African Americans were killed 21 times more than other racial groups. An August 2006 FBI report debriefs white supremacy members infiltrating law enforcement communities throughout the United States. Some side effects of this infiltration consist of law enforcement labeling African Americans as cancers to the community that needs chemotherapy and scumbags. Despite video evidence, only 1% of officers are charged with a crime, and fewer are convicted. Legal cases have proven police officers are less likely to be sentenced due to the creation of statutes and laws to protect them. Some include the Fourth Amendment, Tennessee v. Garner, Graham v. Connor, and Scott v. Harris. Current law enforcement. Towards the end of the Civil War, slave patrols were disbanded, but the practice of controlling and terrorizing African Americans were continued by some members of the white community, Ku Klux Klan, and today's law enforcement officers. In 2016, 258 African Americans were killed by police officers in the United States. Out of the 258 victims, 232 were shot. A study conducted by Craven in 2017 reports this is a problem due to African American men only making up 6% of the United States population. Often overlooked due to media bias are African American women. African American women are disproportionately killed by police officers. African American women are shot at a 20% higher rate than other races, despite representing 13% of the female population in the United States. In addition, African American children are at a higher risk of death by law enforcement versus their white counterparts. This is evident by African American children being killed 6 times more than white children. Classical lynchings and today's electronic lynching. The practice and entertainment of harming African Americans date back to the early days of slavery and exist to this day. A study conducted by Smith in 2011 reports acts such as raping men and women, feeding children to wild dogs, drowning slaves, breeding family members with each other, and public lynchings occurred. African Americans were lynched for any infraction a race soldier felt was justified after the end of slavery. A study conducted by Wintersmith in 1974 found that newspapers would sensationalize these events by giving full details such as how the crowd enjoyed the lynching and its duration for the person to die. The purpose of these public lynchings were to entertain white society and to strike fear into African Americans. Today, these killings are shared through various technological outlets and are no more than widespread snuff films. Snuff films are defined as the killing of an individual in media or in a social venue for the viewer's pleasure. These snuff films are shown throughout various news platforms several times a day and on social media. It should be noted, the majority of the public killings of African Americans in the media primarily focus on men and rarely highlight African American women being killed by police officers. Kimberly Crenshaw reports this is due to a lack of recorded footage and African American women being considered collateral damage during no-knock raids. Due to the limited exposure of these killings, most of these victims' names are quickly forgotten. Hashtags such as Say Her Name and the data collection of African Americans being killed by law enforcement seek to bring more attention to this phenomenon. Interpersonal effects. Due to the ongoing systematic killing of African Americans and its depictions in the media, African American viewers are at a higher risk of developing psychological and physiological disorders. Researchers report watching news accounts of violence can contribute to traumatization. Interpersonal symptoms include anger, paranoia, anxiety, frustration, resentment, low self-esteem, hopelessness, high blood pressure, stroke, diabetes, and an increased deterioration of organs. Interpersonal symptoms include isolation, avoiding police officers, avoiding going to certain areas of a city, or not calling 911. Substance abuse and high-risk behaviors are also listed in interpersonal symptoms. It should be noted that African Americans who strongly identify with their heritage are at a higher risk of developing severe psychological or physiological symptoms. In addition, the replaying of these violent acts compound and create new families with intergenerational trauma in the African American community. This phenomenon parallels vicarious trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and racial trauma. Critical race theory. Critical race theory was selected as a theoretical framework for this study. Critical race theory is a theoretical framework that explores the relationship between race, racism, and power. Critical race theory acknowledges that racism is still present in American society and the illusion of freedom contributes to maintaining the oppression of African Americans. Critical race theory challenges racist discourse through advocacy, scholarship, and counter-narratives. Critical race theory will be used in this study to explain the phenomenon of law enforcement publicly killing African Americans and its effects on the African American community. Conceptual framework. Due to institutional racism, African Americans face a variety of external forces such as intergenerational trauma, first-hand racist encounters, microaggressions, and electronic lynchings. Based on the literature, I hypothesize these psychosocial stressors will elicit interpersonal symptoms, and for some participants, meet the criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. Research questions. I created these research questions to assess whether African Americans experience interpersonal or intrapersonal symptoms. In addition, these questions also will assess whether students meet the criteria of PTSD. Overarching question. What are the intrapersonal effects of African Americans viewing law enforcement publicly killing unarmed African Americans in the media? How does prior, primary, or secondary exposure to traumatic events elicit higher risk of African Americans experiencing intrapersonal symptoms after viewing these publicized killings? After viewing these publicized lynchings, how often do African American students report PTSD symptoms? Qualitative research questions. I created these questions in order to get a better understanding of the quantitative base. Overarching question. What were interviewees' initial thoughts after viewing one of these publicized killings? What are some African American viewers' thoughts on culture playing a role in these systematic killings? How do African American viewers describe interpersonal symptoms after watching these publicized killings? How do African American viewers describe intrapersonal symptoms after watching these publicized killings? Now, in regards to the first question, I created that question because I noticed in some news outlets and blogs, African Americans and other racial groups blame the victim culture in contributing to their own death, such as the way they talk, the music they listen to, the way they dress, the stance during the course of the violent encounter, and the activities that they participated in. Also, some African American viewers have different interpersonal symptoms, Some people experience anger, sadness, numbness, or just confusion. The interpersonal symptoms include avoiding police officers, calling 911, avoiding going to certain parts of town or public settings where majority white individuals congregate. Methodology and research design. The purpose of this mixed methods sequential exploratory study is to examine the interpersonal, intrapersonal effects African Americans experienced after viewing law enforcement killing other African Americans in the media. A mixed methods approach was selected in order to understand the data in more detail by using qualitative follow-up data to help explain the quantitative base. In the quantitative phase of the study, survey data will be collected from 355 African Americans at the University of West Georgia to assess whether secondary trauma symptoms occur after viewing African Americans being killed by police officers in the media. The researcher will send an email to African American undergraduate and graduate students to participate in the study. The email will explain the research study, including inclusion and exclusion criteria for participation, informed consent, confidentiality, and how students can register for the incentive participation program. The inclusion criteria for the study is as follows. The study will only focus on current undergraduate and graduate African American students enrolled at the University of West Georgia. Participants must have an active email address with the university. Before participation, students will complete the informed consent packet, be made aware of the study's adverse effects, and receive referrals to psychotherapy services if they experience intense emotional symptoms by participating in the study. Exclusion criteria. Alumni members of the University of West Georgia, students who are not members of the University of West Georgia, and students who don't identify as African American. The researcher will use the following assessments in the quantitative phase: multidimensional inventory of Black identity, somatic symptom scale 8, and post-traumatic stress disorder checklist. The researcher will later explain the quantitative results in depth by utilizing qualitative data research methods. Using sequential sampling, I will randomly select between 15 to 20 participants from the quantitative phase using random sampling software. Additional participants will be requested if saturation is not met. A focus interview will be utilized in order to generate a deeper understanding of the research questions. The research will also audio record each interview, transcribe it, create codes for themes, discover, and analyze the data. The data collection process will also include a researcher utilizing a journal to reduce biases. I have also considered allowing someone else to conduct the interviews in order to kind of like reduce biases